In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Happy Father's Day to all the fathers. And it's nice when Father's Day falls on Sunday of the Holy Fathers, because I consider this to be Orthodox Father's Day, so it coincides with secular Father's Day. But it's important that we honor our fathers, and it's often the case that for Mother's Day, mothers get a lot of attention, and then fathers sometimes get short shrift, but it's very important the roles that fathers play, and it's important that we recognize it. In the prophecy of Isaiah, chapter 3, verse 5, there's a prophecy about the state of affairs in Judah during the time of Isaiah, which I think is a fair description of our own time. It says, "And the people shall be oppressed, every one by another, and every one by his neighbor. The child shall behave himself proudly against the elderly, and the base against the honorable." So what Isaiah is describing is a time when children are disrespecting their elders, and where people who are base, in other words, they don't have anything that is honorable about them, disrespect those that are honorable. That's the society that we live in today. And that's a sign of God's judgment. But when we say it's a sign of God's judgment, we shouldn't think that God has to step down and work a miracle to make society start having these problems because people are not obeying God's law. God's law is built into the fabric of the universe. It's built into the nature of us as human beings and how we relate to one another. And so when we disregard God's law, there are things that are going to start happening, just like when you jump off of a building and think that you can defy the law of gravity and you go splat. And God didn't have to work a miracle to make that happen, to punish you for jumping off the building. It will happen because it's a law that God built into the fabric of the universe. Well, another law is that if you don't honor those that are more senior than you, and your society is going to start to fall apart, because that's what makes society work. One of the most basic principles of human society we find in the fifth commandment: honor thy father and thy mother, that it may be well with thee, and that thou mayest live long on the good land which the Lord thy God gives to thee. This is the very first commandment of the second table of the law. We divide the 10 Commandments into 2 tables, because there were 2 tablets. The first table of the law all fall under the category of love thy God with all thy heart, mind, soul, and strength. The second table of the law all relates to how we relate with each other. So it's love thy neighbor as thyself. Well, this is the very first thing that we're commanded to do, is to honor our father and our mother. And it's the first commandment, St. Paul tells us, with promise, because it says that it may be well with thee, that thou mayest live long on the good land which the Lord thy God gives thee. Well, what happens when you don't honor your parents and society goes down that road? Well, it's not going to be well for you. Your society is going to start to fall apart. Scripture also fleshes out the implications of honor and respect within the home, within the church, and also within the wider society, because when you read the Father's comment on a commandment like honor thy father, thy mother, they find many implications that are not necessarily obvious just from the words of the commandment itself. But we see in that commandment a requirement that we honor our parents. Why is that? Well, for one thing, our parents are older than us. Our parents are wiser than us. And we owe our parents because they gave us life. And if we had parents that were really worthy of the name, that means that they took care of us, they raised us. And there's nobody that loves a person more than their parents. And so what St. Augustine says about people who don't honor and love their parents is that they won't spare the people that they owe the most to, that love them the most in their life. What will they do with everybody else? What kind of a person is that person going to be to everybody else? They're not going to be an easy person for society to have to deal with. They can't even treat their parents with respect. St. Paul talks about the relationship between a wife and a husband, because obviously that's how you become a father or a mother, is by being a husband and a wife if you're following God's plan. And he begins by talking about, wives, submit yourselves to your own husband as to the Lord. And this is not something that's super comfortable for people to hear in our time because we've had so much indoctrination about feminism, but there's a natural order that God has established in human relations. And I don't want to keep telling the story about this study that was done in Switzerland about which demonstrated that people follow their father's lead more on religious matters than their parents, even though if you were to ask most people, who do you follow more, your mother or your father, when it comes to going to church and your religious walk, most people would instinctively say your mother, obviously, because your mother is the one that does most of the day-to-day teaching you and instructing you in the faith. But it's a fact that people will follow their father's lead. And so if you have a father that really is not going to church because he doesn't really care, or if he's only going because his wife is dragging him to church, there's a lot less of a likelihood that children in that home are going to grow up as faithful Christians because they're looking to their father for leadership, and in that case, they're not getting good leadership. So we can like it or not, but that's just the way that God created human beings to function in a family, and that's the natural order. And the thing is, we have many relationships in which we have a person in authority over us, and we have to submit to their authority. My bishop has authority over me. There's a certain sense in which you could say that we are equal. We are both people who are created in the image of God. We're both going to stand before God on the day of judgment. But I have to obey my bishop as long as he's telling me to do something that's within the bounds of his authority, because that's how order is maintained in the church. And that doesn't mean that the bishop doesn't listen to anything I have to say or he treats me like dirt. The bishop treats me very well, as a matter of fact. And if I express an opinion to him, he takes it seriously. He doesn't necessarily go with it, but he at least will hear me out. Well, that's the way it should be between a husband and a wife. The husband is supposed to be the head of the home. And if he's not the head of the home, that means you've got some dysfunction in that home. And the wife should really want the husband to be the head of the home for the very reason I just stated, because your children are going to be looking to your father or not. So if you don't let your husband really be the spiritual leader in the home, you're going to wind up having your children being led by him anyway, but not in a positive way. But then he goes on to say, husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself for her. So that's a responsibility that husbands have. They have to treat their wives with love and care. And just like a farmer when he's taking care of his land and he's growing crops, that's where the word husband comes from, is from this image. He doesn't treat the land terrible if he actually wants to have good crops. He spends all this time cultivating that field. Well, if you're treating your wife badly, you're just making sure that you're not going to have a good harvest in terms of your home life. You've got to love your wife as a husband. But then at the very end of this reading that we hear in wedding services, St. Paul says, nevertheless, let each one of you in particular so love his own wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. And it's interesting that he places emphasis on the wife respecting her husband, but the husband loving his wife. And I don't think that we should take that to mean that the husband shouldn't respect his wife or that the wife shouldn't love her husband. Obviously, both of those things are true. But there's something about men and their nature that needs respect and the approval of the women in their life for them to really be empowered to do what it is that they do. And so this is something that's very important. More broadly, in terms of our relationships outside of marriage, we're also admonished to respect all of our elders and not just our parents. In Leviticus chapter 19, the same chapter where it says, love thy neighbor as thyself, it says, thou shalt rise up before the gray head and honor the face of the old man and fear thy God, I am the Lord. So he's saying you're supposed to honor the elderly. And they've lived longer than you. They're probably wiser than you are. And they're also weaker than you are. So you show them respect because they've been around for a long time. And one day you're going to be in their situation if you live long enough. And you're going to want people to treat you that way. So this is loving your neighbor as yourself. We're also admonished to not take advantage of those who are weak. Thou shalt not curse the deaf, nor put a stumbling block before the blind, but shalt fear of thy God, I am the Lord. And so, for example, in church, we only have limited seating in a traditional Orthodox church. And if you're sitting on the bench and you're perfectly healthy and there is an old person that's standing because they didn't get here early enough to claim their spot, you should say, hey, you can sit here because they're older than you are. And also, if someone is walking with a crutch and they obviously can barely stand, even though they might be younger than you are, you would do the same thing because they're weaker than you are. So these are the kinds of things that the scriptures tell us about loving and respecting other people. St. Paul in 1 Timothy is addressing St. Timothy, who's a young man who's been put in authority over a local church by St. Paul, and he's admonishing him on how to go about his responsibilities. He has a responsibility of guiding the people in that church, but he's got people who are older than he is in that church. He's young. And so in chapter 5, beginning with the first verse, St. Paul says, rebuke not an elder, but exhort him as a father, and the younger man as brethren, and the elder women as mothers, the younger as sisters, with all purity. So St. Timothy had a responsibility in terms of his position in the church to guide those in that church. But St. Paul is saying, even though you've got this authority, when you're talking to an older man or an older woman, you want to treat them like they're your mother or your father. You want to exhort them in the same way you would if you had to say something to your father or your mother in terms of telling them to do something different than what they're doing, but you would do it in a very loving way. And if you're dealing with people who are the same age as you or younger, you treat them as your brother and your sister, not like kids often treat their brothers and their sisters, but like mature adults do when they're mature enough to really start to love their siblings and to respect them. And you treat them like family, and that's the way society, if people are acting that way, functions, because there's love, there's respect, there's order. And if this is true to St. Timothy, who was in a position of great authority in the church, how much more is it true of each and every one of us in terms of how we should respect those who are older than us? And in particular, men should treat women with respect. And this is one thing that it's saying. And modern feminism has done a number on our society. It's done lots of damage, and we have people reacting to that. But we have people who are reacting to that not in a way that they're really going back to tradition, but where they're doing things that are very toxic and negative. There's a movement, that we have all these acronyms that keep popping up, and I have to Google them to figure out what they mean. But MGTOW is an acronym that's become a thing, and that means men going their own ways. You've got these guys in what's called the manosphere. They're saying, I'm an alpha male, and I'm not going to have I don't care. Women are trash. Women are trash, and I'm not going to be in any kind of a relationship where I have to depend on that woman. I'm going to just do whatever I want to do, live my own way. That's not healthy. And one thing I would say about that is, having worked in an office situation for much of my adult life, and most of the time often being the only man or one of a handful of men in that office, mostly working with women, it always struck me that the women treated me very well and the other men very well, but they would treat each other often very badly. So when you have these guys that are starting to treat women the way women often treat other women, you have to say, is this because they're feminized? And I think that it is. So ironically, these guys beating their chest, saying they're the alpha males, they're treating women like other women do because they've been feminized. They need to treat women the way Christian men are supposed to treat women, in a healthy, respectful way. And obviously, if you're going to give up on women, there's only certain options available to you, and none of them are moral or Christian. So you shouldn't pay any attention to someone who starts talking like that. St. Paul, in 1 Corinthians 11, where he's talking about women covering their heads, he talks about how, the man came first and the woman was created for the man. But he says, but the man is not apart from the woman and the woman is not apart from the man. It's not like we can exist without each other. We need each other. And it's in society that is not the norm, where people are treating each other with love and respect. It's a society that's going to fall apart. Now, our society may indeed go to hell in a handbasket, and there may not be much that we can do about it. But we have control over our own family life. We have control over our homes. We have a lot more influence within our church, within our local community, and we need to return to traditional standards of honor and respect, and we need to teach our children to learn how honor and respect is supposed to actually function in terms of their dealings with each other, in terms of their dealing with other adults. So they learn to relate to other human beings in a loving, familial way, and not in the toxic way that so many people in our society would have us do. Amen.